The life of Galileo Galilei as an astronomer. Galileo Galilei was a Tuscan physicist, mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher who played a major role in the scientific revolution. In the 1500s, most people believed in the geocentric theory, the theory that everything revolved around Earth. But Galileo believed in the heliocentric theory, the theory that Earth revolves around the sun. His beliefs interfered with his religion, and Galileo struggled to prove his point. Galileo was a man of many talents, and this documentary will tell you what he accomplished and how it all affected us today. Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy, the northern Italian region of Tuscany, on February 15, 1564. He was the oldest of 7 children. Galileo's father was Vincenzo Galilei, a musician. It is believed that Galileo had picked up his father's approach to solving problems. As a child, Galileo was tutored privately. In 1574, Galileo's family moved to Florence. At that time, Galileo went to a monastery school. Vincenzo wanted Galileo's education to bring him money in the future. In 1581, Vincenzo sent Galileo off to the University of Pisa to study medicine. The science taught in the 1500s at universities were entirely based on the teachings of Greek philosophers. But Galileo didn't believe everything he was taught. He refused to accept anything that couldn't be proved by experiments. Galileo quickly lost interest in medicine and moved on to something like math, which excited him more. In 1585, Galileo returned to Florence. He began to give private lessons and soon started to gain a reputation as a mathematician. He hoped to gain posts as a professor, but no offers came. In 1587, Galileo became impatient, so he traveled to Rome. He met Christopher Calvius, a mathematician and astronomer. They created a lifelong friendship, but Galileo still didn't find a job. He returned and moved to Florence, and eventually his reputation grew and he was invited to give a lecture at the Academy of Florence. In 1589, Galileo was appointed professor of mathematics at his old University of Pisa. Not before long, the university authorities discovered Galileo's nature did not change at all. Galileo's theory was that the Earth revolved around the sun. Galileo could not prove his point yet, but he made predictions. The first telescope ever made was in the Netherlands, and a year later Galileo heard of it. The Senate of Venice was thinking about buying this telescope, but Galileo said he would make a far better version. He managed to get a description, and he built his own. The Doge of Venice was extremely impressed, and Galileo was immediately appointed professor of mathematics of Padua for life with a very high salary. Toward the end of 1609, Galileo turned his telescope to the night sky and gained all the proof he needed. When Galileo looked through his telescope, he was delighted. The moon was not a perfect sphere and smooth like Aristotle said, it was rocky and rough. When Galileo looked at Jupiter, there were 4 moons of its own and it was a center of motion. Galileo could not keep all these discoveries to himself, so in March of 1610 he published a book called The Starry Messenger. This book became a national bestseller, but the Catholic Church was outraged. In September, Galileo left Padua and returned to Florence. He was on a firm ground, and all he had to do was demonstrate that the Copernicus was right and everybody would listen. He realized later how wrong he was, but by then it was too late. Galileo continued his observations in Florence. Galileo discovered that like the moon, Venus had phases and seemed to change size. This could only mean that it moved around the sun, not Earth. If Galileo's observations were correct, the Catholics would have to give up their view of the universe. Some decided to defend their beliefs by saying what Galileo saw through his telescope were illusions. To strengthen his case, Galileo confirmed his observations from an independent resource, Johannes Kepler. Kepler was long gone to Peru, so Galileo went to Christopher for help. He went to Jesuit College of Rome, where Calvus and his fellow astronomers looked through the telescope Galileo brought and saw what he described. Galileo also went to see Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a mathematician. Barberini agreed with his views, but he could not persuade people publicly. Galileo went back to Florence and convinced that his visit had been a success. Galileo was not afraid that many of his enemies, that included professors and scholars who were also jealous of Galileo's position, were ready to fight. In the end, Galileo was accused of being unable to understand what he was talking about. Some thought he was insane. Around this time, Galileo started another argument. Father Christoph Scheiner, a Jesus astronomer, looked through his telescope and saw spots on the sun. He thought they were small planets, but Galileo believed that they were sunspots. Galileo considered this as a criticism of his observations, so Galileo wrote letters explaining his own evidence as well as saying Christoph's observations were wrong. Deli Colombe now argued that Galileo had denied the authority of the Bible, which clearly stated that the earth stood still. Many people were suspicious of his work. Soon, for the first time, Galileo became concerned. Many people asked him to prove that the earth revolved around the sun. Soon the worst came. In 1616, the Pope told Galileo to hold or defend. Galileo agreed because he felt it was his only option. In 1624, Galileo's good friend Maffeo Barberini became Pope VIII. Galileo convinced that he would be able to persuade him. The Pope agreed, but Galileo had to show a balanced account of the two world systems. Galileo returned to Florence and went to work. Galileo published a book under a friend's name called The Dialogue of the Two Great World Systems. Many people knew that this was his writing. Galileo's enemies found their chance. They complained to the Pope that the book was in favor of heliocentrism. The Pope put Galileo on trial, which angered him because he thought they were very good friends. At Galileo's trial, the judges questioned a document stating Galileo was not allowed to describe his views of Copernicus, or as known today, heliocentrism. This surprised Galileo because he had never heard of this document. He had no one to back him up because Bellarmine had died a few years back. At the hearing, the Commissary General of Institution told him that the trial would continue for a long time if Galileo did not confess. Galileo refused, and the institution persuaded him by saying they'd burn him alive. If Galileo would admit, they'd leave him alone. Galileo agreed. He knew he wouldn't win this case against such powerful people. At the end of his trial, Galileo believed he had no choice, so he confessed. He said that he had mistakenly presented the Copernicus view and had been wrong to say that the earth revolved around the sun. He was put on arrest, but it wasn't too bad. He was soon put on house arrest. Galileo was no longer allowed to express his views of the solar system forever. Even though Galileo had to stop teaching his views of the solar system, he made many discoveries in science and math. He accomplished many things. Galileo died from a natural disease in 1642 after becoming blind. He was buried at Santa Claus in 1737. In 1741, Pope Benedict XIV authorized publication of Galileo's work. It wasn't until October 31, 1992, that the Church under Pope John Paul II expressed regret as to how Galileo had been treated in response to a pontifical council for a culture study. Galileo not only changed the way people saw the world, he also changed the way scientists experimented, observed, and reached conclusions. While he is most known for his astronomical discoveries, his contributions to the scientific method are equally important. Galileo's discoveries and methods have influenced today's modern science immensely. Because of his discovery of the telescope, he made it possible for newer scientists to enhance them and look farther into space. Furthermore, his discoveries proved that the heliocentric theory, and this made it possible for newer astronomers to enhance them. Unfortunately, Galileo's discoveries came to an end when he died in 1642, but he will always be known as the man who changed space forever.